Hey, everybody, and welcome to Golden Breakthrough. I'm your host, Hunter, and as you might notice, it's just me today. So, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, if I were to give you a quote, would essentially be don't build a 2024 company in 2026. I've said this to a lot of people. It's a recurring topic in some of my conversations, but what does that really mean? So the core era that I've nailed down at the moment is the era of the LLM, which is now. That starts in November 22 with the ChatGPT release. Within this era, which we're obviously still living through until whatever's next finally comes, we have a few different periods. First of all, the first period is the period of the model. That also kicks off in November 2022 with the ChatGPT release. And that's followed by, hot take, the period of the agent, which I put at summer 2025, which is when ChatGPT 5 released. Now, the big difference between these two periods here, first of all, the period of the model is when model performance was tantamount. The reason why I have a different period beginning as of ChatGPT 5, I didn't realize it at the time, but I had some inkling of it at the time as of, I believe it was August 5th or 8th, 2025. But as of the ChatGPT 5 release, it became abundantly clear that model performance was significantly leveling out, and the hyperscaling approach was leading to diminishing returns. Really, the core innovations have not been in the model, it's been in the software surrounding the model. First of all, we have the epoch of the prompt. Within the epoch of the prompt, that's where prompt engineering is really focused on. I'm sure we all remember this early period when you have just a raw model and you're just prompting it directly. These are very simple solutions. These are your core naive chatbots where you're really leaning on the core model's performance for most of what your application does. Most of the applications that we saw in this particular era are essentially raw API calls to ChatGPT. I remember one of the earliest AI features that was being developed at Syndeso was a pun generator, specifically that was based on the contents of your shopping cart. Now, we could very easily argue that the shopping cart is part of the context, which we'll get into context in a moment. But I would argue that inserting a product name as part of a shell prompt and then having a core prompt in terms of asking for a pun is kind of quintessential prompt engineering, right? So the limitations of that are pretty straightforward, right? If you're leaning on the model, models are trained on old data, and that's what leads us into context, the epoch of the context and context engineer. I put the epoch of the context at June 2025 when the first references to context engineering came out. Now, context engineering, that's the next evolution here. Your model doesn't know anything about you, doesn't know anything about your system, so you have to tell it all of this stuff. So the products that we see here are your slightly more intelligent chatbots, your customer support bots, for example, where you have a FAQ or a playbook or something like that. You give that to the agent, you give your prompt to the agent, it gives you something back. So this is kind of what I mean for the most part when I say 2024 companies, even though I'm penning this era at 2025. I wish I had really great examples of products that encompass prompt engineering and context engineering, but realistically, we've moved so far past that. So again, context as a tool, we ran into limitations there pretty quickly because of the attention mechanism of the transformer. First of all, attention gets diluted when you have a large context. And also, plugging in a really large context is really expensive. So it means that if you plug in a really large context, not only does your model get confused, it also gets more and more expensive, which means that to really effectively run a product, you need something more than the context. Essentially, instead of getting the model all of the context all of the time, which is essentially impossible, what if you gave your model only a subset of the context only when it needs to? And that's where we start seeing things like MCPs. Like MCPs were really one of the first core innovations to say, hey, when you're filling the context window, what if we only went out and got some essential tools there? Now, of course, the MCPs themselves consume part of the context window, but essentially you're consuming a static part of the context window to prevent context spilling out and having to give it a whole bunch of stuff every single time, much of which might be chaff because you have to figure out what's important. Uh, so moving on, this kind of brings us to the period of the agent here. And this is where, as I was saying, like prompted contexts are really leaning very heavily on the model. Once we've gotten tools like MCPs, we're starting to really boost out of just directly leaning on the model and leaning on the overall surrounding architecture, essentially the tools that you're providing to the model. So the first epoch inside of the period of the agent, I'm calling the epoch of Claw, essentially because Claude, now known as OpenClaw, really hit the internet by storm. And again, this is another tool that it seems like we really hit and really immediately saw the limitations of. It was incredibly expensive to run, although, immediately at the time you could use subsidized tokens from various flat rate plans, which stopped shortly thereafter. But additionally, insecure and also just required a ton of permissions. And the linkage of it to cron meant that it was extremely persistent, which is great for a POC that I don't know about others, but for me personally, I know I don't want that level of persistence. I want things to try to do something and then tell me about it. So the core reason why I felt like this deserved its own epoch is that really Claw set the foundations and inspired a lot of the future agentic stuff, predominantly not because of Claw itself, but because Claude, given that it was open source, provided a neat little core that people could swap pieces out of. So, for example, I don't believe there was very much discussion about, at least I was not party to a lot of discussion around memory for agents until Claude came out and exposed its, I believe it was a dreaming memory system, which is very interesting because that memory system was tied very heavily to a particular anthropomorphized version of LLMs. I should say, with all of this innovation on top of Claw, that's really what has brought us more fully into the epoch of harness, which is February 2026, generally speaking, when the first usages of harness engineering have begun being core. So what's really interesting about this particular period, which I would argue that we're in right now, is that OpenClaw inspired features are being brought into other harnesses like Claude Code, for example, have been brought into Claude Code. We've seen an explosion of memory management systems. Skills are getting better and easier to use. The memory management systems, I would argue actually that essentially what we saw earlier with context engineering and memory are kind of the same problem, just now moved out of the model layer and into the surrounding architecture, which is to say, how do you connect a vector database? How do you connect other software to say, I have this question, feed into this question all of the context that's most relevant to this question. And so vector databases, Mila Jovovich's Memory Palace, I believe it was GBrain as part of the G stack, all have been memory mechanisms, and I'm sure there's thousands more on top of this, that allow this sort of context engineering to no longer be done by a human, but the overarching harness does it for us. We've also seen Hermes, for example. There's more and more OpenClaw-like solutions, NemoClaw. But so that kind of brings us to the present now. Most of what I'm seeing right now is using agents in kind of one-off situations. There are some recurring situations where the same agent can be plugged in, but that seems to be pretty rare at the moment. As a result, most of the economic activity now is kind of one-off consulting. We even see that in Anthropic at the moment. But it's pretty clear that the writing's on the wall that all of these big players, they're doing consulting activity so that they can come up with discrete products that they can provide at scale to blow the consulting activity out of the water. So, I mean, I say this as someone that's engaged in deploying one-off agents for people. I see a real world where 3, 6 months from now, that economic activity is just gone for me because Anthropic has completely eaten my market share, which is, that makes it pretty clear what the next step is, in my opinion, which is moving from the harness to the workflow. So once you have a set of agents that are really good at particular tasks, instead of having those agents do just one task, what if you have a set of agents, a swarm, that are all utilized together to complete some form of discrete activity? So I am actively engaged in building and deploying some of these. Essentially, what you want to do is, if general purpose agents are not fantastic because of context limitations, right? The tighter your context is, the tighter your prompt is, the better they behave, the more reliable they are. So you need to have discrete agents for identifying things that need to be done. Those need to put data into a system. Then you have other agents that execute on those pieces of work, and you've got a nice autonomous flow. So what I'm calling that is workflows for the moment. I don't know if we're going to enter into a full age of the workflow and workflow engineering anytime in this future, but I would not be surprised if that or a similar abstraction does become the dominant epoch as of, let's say, before December of this year. I'm really interested in what's going to happen after that, though, because I definitely don't have a clear view of what the next level of abstraction is after that. And I guess I'll plug some pluggables. Hi, I'm running this podcast, and I would love it if you told your friends about this if this is useful to you. I'd love it if you subscribed if you've enjoyed this video and the other videos that I've had. And if you want to share it on social media, phone a friend, get your community involved, that would be fantastic. That would be fantastic because I'm here to help other people out. I'm here to share my knowledge. Hope this is interesting. Hope this is useful. I hope you all have a fantastic day. Peace.